The Arizona Territory, a place where the earth cracked under the punishing sun, where the wind carried dust like whispers of the dead, and where men vanished into canyons so vast they seemed to swallow time itself. In the mid to late 19th century, this landscape was not just a wilderness, it was a crucible, a harsh, unyielding expanse that tested every soul who dared to cross it. And for some, those tests drove them to desperation and into outlawry. When the U.S. government carved the Arizona Territory out of the New Mexico Territory in 1863, it was still little more than a mapmaker's line drawn across an unforgiving desert. Civilization clung only to small mining camps, army forts, and a handful of dusty towns. Tucson, with its adobe walls and narrow streets, remained more Mexican than American, while Prescott and later Phoenix were struggling outposts, their populations dwarfed by the wilderness around them. For every settlement that managed to survive, dozens of others were abandoned to the coyotes and the winds. Law enforcement, too, was scarce. A few U.S. Marshals, some county sheriffs, and cavalry detachments scattered across hundreds of miles could scarcely hope to cover it all. Justice often rode on horseback, armed with a worn badge and a six-gun, chasing rumors as much as fugitives. By the time a posse could form, the bandits were often long gone, swallowed by mountains, deserts, or the twisting canyons along the Mexican border. The lure of riches only sharpened the stakes. Mining discoveries in Tombstone, Bisbee, and Jerome filled stagecoaches with silver bullion and wagons with supplies. Freight companies carried whiskey and rifles, while stage lines hauled payrolls for miners and ranchers alike. To an outlaw with a fast horse and an iron nerve, every rattling coach that crossed a lonely trail was more than a target. It was a chance at survival, a gamble for freedom, or the promise of quick wealth in a world that rarely offered either. Travelers feared the long stretches of desert road. Stagecoaches were the arteries of the territory, but they were also rolling coffins when bandits struck. Passengers huddled inside, clutching their purses, knowing that one shadow behind a mesquite or the flash of a pistol could mean their end. The desert itself conspired with the bandits. Trails twisted, dust storms blinded, and the nearest fort might be 3 days' ride away. It was in this lawless frontier that desperados earned their name. The very word, desperado, spoke not only of recklessness, but of men who had nothing left to lose. Some had deserted armies, some were failed miners, their dreams buried in empty pans and played-out veins. Some were fugitives from the east or Mexico, finding in the desert both sanctuary and stage for their violence. And some, born under the Arizona sun, grew up with outlawry in their blood, inheriting the grudges of border wars and the hunger of empty bellies. But not all who were branded as bandits were truly criminals. The lines blurred. A man might be a thief to one community and a folk hero to another. For Mexican villagers along the border, a raider who struck Anglo ranchers was sometimes celebrated as a champion of the dispossessed. For settlers from the east, those same figures were monsters who threatened every wagon and homestead. The desert made no distinction. It simply bore witness. The clash of cultures deepened the danger. The Apache, whose ancestral lands covered much of Arizona, were fighting their own war for survival. Bands under Geronimo, Cochise, and Victorio launched raids into settlements and freight lines, resisting the advance of forts and miners who scarred their homeland. In this climate of constant fear, every raid, whether by Apache warriors, Mexican border outlaws, or Anglo bandits, was magnified by rumor until the desert seemed haunted by phantoms with rifles. And so, the legend of the Arizona Desperado was born. The newspapers in Tucson, Prescott, and even San Francisco devoured these stories. Tales of masked riders who robbed stages, phantom bandits who melted into the canyons, and train robbers who laughed in the face of armed guards filled their columns. Sometimes the truth was stretched, sometimes invented whole, but always with the same effect. The Arizona Territory was branded in the public imagination as a land of outlawry. In that land, names like William Brazen Bill Brazleton, the Apache Kid, and Augustine Chacon would rise like desert storms. Brief, violent, unforgettable. And later the wild bunch themselves would thunder through, leaving fire and legend in their wake. But before we ride with them, pause for a moment and picture it. The year is 1878. You are a traveler on a stagecoach bound for Tucson. The night air is dry, the stars sharp as knives, the wheels rattling over stony ground. Suddenly the horses rear. A figure steps from the shadows. A sack covers his face, his pistol gleams in the moonlight. His voice, cold and steady, orders you to step down. Your heart pounds as you realize you have just met one of the desert desperados of Arizona territory. The desert was a stage, and the desperados its actors. Their stories of hunger, of greed, of vengeance were written not in ink, but in blood, dust, and the fleeting echoes of gunfire across the mesas. This was the world of Arizona bandits. This is where our tale begins. Stagecoach travel in the Arizona territory was an exercise in endurance and courage. The coaches themselves were heavy Concord wagons, built of oak and iron, swaying violently as they lurched over rocky trails. Passengers, crammed together on leather seats, endured choking dust by day and freezing winds by night. To ride a stage was to gamble with your comfort, your patience, and often your life. The roads were long, the terrain treacherous, and every turn of the trail might reveal a waiting bandit. For that reason, companies like Wells Fargo equipped their drivers and messengers with rifles and shotguns, arming them against the very real threat of ambush. The Wells Fargo messenger, sometimes called a shotgun guard, earned his pay by sitting up front with a loaded 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun, scanning the ridges and mesquite thickets for movement. The phrase riding shotgun was no metaphor here. It was a matter of life and death. It was into this perilous world that William Brazen Bill Brazleton rode with a ruthlessness that struck fear into both passengers and express companies. Brazleton was not a household name back east. In fact, little is known of his early life. Some claimed he drifted west from Texas. Others whispered that he had served in the Confederate cavalry, honing his skills with a revolver in the chaos of war. Whatever his past, by the late 1870s, he had earned his reputation in Arizona as a masked highwayman of chilling boldness. His disguise was as memorable as his crimes. Witnesses recalled a burlap flour sack pulled over his head, with crude eye holes cut into the fabric. The sight of this faceless figure stepping into the moonlight, Colt revolver steady in his grip, was enough to drain the courage from any traveler. It was said his voice, firm, low, and commanding, was almost more terrifying than the pistol itself. On the night of July 31st, 1878, near Tucson, Brazleton struck one of his most infamous robberies. A stagecoach bound from Florence carried passengers along the dusty road, the silver moon casting long shadows. Suddenly the horses shied. A figure appeared from the brush. Masked, armed, demanding surrender. Passengers froze as the outlaw's revolver swept over them. With cold efficiency, he stripped men of their watches and wallets, forced the driver to unload Wells Fargo's strongbox, and disappeared into the desert darkness. What set Brazleton apart was not simply his robberies, but the audacity with which he carried them out. Stage after stage fell victim, each account feeding the rumor mill. In Tucson, the newspapers were quick to christen him Brazen Bill, a name that captured both his reckless courage and the sensationalism of the time. The Tucson Citizen and Arizona Star printed stories of his deeds, some factual, others exaggerated, but all calculated to sell papers to a readership eager for tales of blood and banditry. Yet every outlaw eventually meets his reckoning. Brazleton's came swiftly. After a string of robberies, Wells Fargo, tired of losing silver in payrolls to the masked bandit, put up a hefty reward for his capture. Local lawmen, ranchers, and hired guns formed posses, scouring the desert canyons for any trace of him. The Arizona heat punished man and beast alike, but desperation drove them on. The end came in August 1878. Acting on a tip, lawmen ambushed Brazleton near Tucson. Accounts differ, but the fight was brief and violent. Gunfire cracked through the mesquite thickets. Brazleton fought hard, but the odds were against him. By the time the smoke cleared, the desperado lay lifeless in the dirt, his sack mask torn away, his pistol still near his hand. His death was met with both relief and fascination. Tucson's newspapers carried lurid descriptions of the outlaw's final stand, painting him as a figure both demonic and strangely heroic. The sack mask, soaked in dust and sweat, was displayed as a grim trophy, a reminder that even the boldest desperado could not outrun the desert's justice. Brazleton's reign had been short, but it left a mark on the imagination of the Arizona territory. Stagecoaches continued to roll, passengers continued to fear, and bandits continued to lurk. But the story of Brazen Bill became part of the legend. A man who dared to stare down Wells Fargo's shotgun, who robbed under the desert stars, and who met his fate in the lonely silence of the Arizona night. And yet the desert did not rest. For even as Brazleton fell, new figures were rising from the mountains and borderlands. Among them was one who would haunt the territory like a phantom, the Apache Kid, soldier turned renegade, hero to some, villain to others. His story would outlast Brazleton's, fueled not only by gunpowder but by the collision of cultures that defined the Southwest. The story of the Apache Kid is not just the tale of one outlaw. It is the story of a people caught between two worlds, of broken promises and bitter wars, of a man who began as a trusted scout for the U.S. Army and ended as one of the most feared and mythologized fugitives in Arizona territory. The Kid, his Apache name is lost to history, was born in the 1860s among the Aravipa band of the Western Apache. He grew up in a time when his people were being pushed into reservations, their freedom curtailed, their culture under siege. For young Apache men, choices were few: resist and face extermination, or adapt and survive as best they could. The Kid chose, at least at first, to adapt. By the early 1880s, he had joined the ranks of the U.S. Army's Apache Scouts, a unique corps of native men enlisted to track and fight their own. These scouts became indispensable to the Army during the campaigns against Geronimo and other Apache leaders who refused confinement. The Kid proved himself skilled, resourceful, and loyal, rising to the rank of sergeant. Officers respected him. Fellow scouts trusted him. To many, he was proof that peace might be possible. But the line between soldier and outlaw was perilously thin on the frontier. In 1887, during a dispute among scouts at San Carlos Reservation, violence erupted. Accounts differ. Some say the Kid sought to avenge a drunken insult, others that he acted rashly to protect his men. Whatever the cause, shots were fired, men were killed, and the Kid suddenly found himself not as a soldier, but as a prisoner. Court-martialed, sentenced, then briefly pardoned, the Kid's fate swung like a pendulum. Eventually, he was condemned to a lengthy prison term. Shackled and loaded onto a wagon, he and several others were being transported when they made a daring escape in the Pinal Mountains. Guards were killed. The Kid vanished into the high desert wilderness. From that moment, history and legend blurred. Settlers whispered that the Apache Kid had sworn vengeance, that he prowled the trails at night, striking ranches and ambushing travelers. Newspapers reported every raid, every killing, every theft of horses as the Kid's handiwork. Whether it was Apaches defending their land, Mexican raiders crossing the border, or common rustlers, blame was laid at the feet of the phantom fugitive. To Anglo settlers, the Kid became a bogeyman, a reminder that the frontier was never truly safe. Mothers warned children to behave lest the Apache Kid steal them away. Ranchers rode armed, even to fetch water. Posses hunted him through mountains and arroyos, but he always seemed one step ahead, a shadow fading into the rocks. Yet among the Apache, his story was told differently. To some, he was a tragic figure, betrayed by the very army he had served. They remembered him as a man caught in a cycle of injustice, punished not only for his actions, but for his identity. Oral traditions whispered that the Kid was not the ruthless killer the newspapers painted him to be, but a scapegoat for every crime committed in the borderlands. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Historians debate whether the Kid was responsible for half the deeds attributed to him. Some believe he fled south into Mexico and lived quietly under another name. Others claim he roamed Arizona for decades, evading capture until old age took him. A few insist he still haunts the Sierra Madre, an eternal fugitive. What is certain is the fear he inspired. One mining company posted a standing bounty for his capture. The Army dispatched scouts to pursue their former comrade. Even seasoned lawmen admitted the difficulty. The Kid knew the terrain better than any white soldier ever could. He vanished into canyons, appeared without warning, left trails that turned in on themselves like desert mirages. To the settlers of the Arizona Territory, the Apache Kid was the embodiment of their fears, the wild, untamed force of the desert given human form. To his own people, he symbolized survival in the face of betrayal, And to history, he remains one of the most enigmatic figures of the Wild West, a man whose very name became a legend. As the 19th century drew toward its end, the Apache Kid faded into rumor. Some said he was killed in a skirmish. Others swore they saw him decades later, riding silently across the Mexican border. But whether alive or dead, his presence lingered like the desert wind. The outlaw who had once worn the uniform of a U.S. Army scout became the ghost of Arizona territory, his story etched into both folklore and fear. And while his shadow moved across the mountains, another Desperados legend was growing on the borderlands. A man named Augustine Chacon, whose daring escapes and bloody raids would make him both a folk hero and a terror to the law. The deserts and mountains of Arizona did not stop at the border with Mexico, and neither did the lives of those who inhabited them. The line drawn across the Sonoran wilderness was more political than practical, and to men like Augustine Chacon, it meant little more than a new stage upon which to play out his defiance. To Anglo settlers and sheriffs, Chacon was the most ruthless bandit in the Southwest. To many in the Mexican villages of Sonora, he was remembered differently, a man who took from the wealthy and powerful and, on occasion, gave to the poor. Like so many figures of the Wild West, his legacy rests in the uneasy tension between outlaw and folk hero. Chacon was born in Sonora, Mexico, in the mid-19th century. From the beginning, he was shaped by the borderlands' violence and inequities. Mining booms drew Anglo prospectors into lands long occupied by Mexican and indigenous families. Ranches expanded, pushing out smallholders and sparking resentments that ran deep. For many Mexican families, the U.S. advance into Arizona territory felt like an invasion. In this turbulent setting, young men often found themselves with few options: labor in the mines, scrape out a meager existence on thin soil, or turn to raiding. By the 1890s, Chacon had chosen the latter path. His robberies and raids stretched across the border, targeting American ranchers, stage lines, and, on occasion, Mexican elites whom he considered collaborators. His reputation grew quickly, not just because of the violence, but because of his uncanny ability to escape capture. In 1896, Chacon was captured and imprisoned in Solomonville, Arizona, after being convicted of murder. To settlers, it seemed the territory's long nightmare was finally over. But Chacon was not one to accept confinement. With a combination of daring and ruthlessness, he escaped from the heavily guarded jail, killing 2 deputies in the process. News of the jailbreak spread like wildfire. The Arizona Republican newspaper called him the most dangerous bandit in the Southwest, warning that no rancher or traveler was safe while he remained at large. Pauses were raised, bloodhounds set loose, and armed men scoured the Gila Valley. Yet time and again, Chacon slipped through their fingers. He knew the trails, the canyons, and the desert washes better than the lawmen who pursued him. Like the Apache Kid before him, he became a phantom. Here one moment, gone the next. Some said he had sympathizers who sheltered him. Others claimed entire villages protected him out of loyalty or fear. And indeed, in parts of Sonora, Chacon's name was spoken with admiration. To villagers weary of exploitation by mining companies and foreign ranchers, he was a figure of resistance. Rumors spread that he shared loot with the poor, that he punished only the wealthy, that his violence was a form of justice. Whether these stories were fact or fable mattered little. They gave him the aura of a Robin Hood of the borderlands. But there was nothing mythical about the fear he inspired in Arizona. Ranchers rode armed to the teeth. Wells Fargo doubled their guards. The governor himself pressed for stronger military patrols along the border. Chacon's name was invoked in saloons and campfires alike, often with a glance over the shoulder as if he might appear from the shadows. In 1902, his luck finally faltered. After another spree of raids, Chacon was captured once again, this time through deception and betrayal. He was tried, sentenced, and executed by hanging in Solomonville. On the day of his death, the gallows were surrounded by townsfolk and officials, some watching in grim satisfaction, others with unease. A man who had been both terror and symbol now faced the final reckoning. Even in death, however, Chacon's story did not fade. Songs and corridos were composed about him in Sonora, painting him as a champion of the people. In Arizona, his legend persisted as a cautionary tale of lawlessness unchecked. Historians later argued that his notoriety was exaggerated by newspapers eager to sell copies, while others pointed out the social and political grievances that had fueled men like Chacon. What is undeniable is that his name still echoes when the history of Arizona's desperados is told. He was a man who lived on both sides of a contested border, who defied the law, and who, in the end, embodied the contradictions of the frontier itself. Outlaw to some, folk hero to others. As the 20th century dawned, the old breed of bandits was fading. Law was tightening its grip. Telegraph wires, railroads, and larger towns meant that desperados could no longer vanish so easily. But even as local legends like Chacon fell, new figures arrived from farther north. Men who would make headlines across the nation. They were called the Wild Bunch, and their daring train robberies would shake Arizona to its core. By the late 1890s, Arizona Territory was no stranger to desperados. Stagecoach robbers, border raiders, and phantom fugitives had all left their mark. Yet none carried the same blend of daring, organization, and sheer audacity as the gang that came to be known as the Wild Bunch. Led by Robert Leroy Parker, better known as Butch Cassidy, and his partner Harry Longabaugh, the infamous Sundance Kid, this band of outlaws transformed the Southwest into their hunting ground. Unlike the lone desperados who haunted canyons and ambushed dusty stages, the Wild Bunch was a network, disciplined, mobile, and surprisingly modern in their approach. They struck with precision, carefully timing their raids and scouting their targets. And Arizona, with its booming mines and vulnerable transport routes, was too rich a prize to resist. Mining towns like Tombstone, Bisbee, and Jerome churned out silver and copper, their payrolls carried by stagecoach and rail across lonely desert tracks. Wealth moved faster than the law could guard it, and Cassidy's gang knew how to take advantage. In 1899, they staged one of the most audacious robberies in American history, the Wilcox train robbery. On June 2, 1899, near Wilcox, Arizona, the Wild Bunch struck. As the locomotive steamed through the desert night, the gang placed dynamite charges along the track, forcing the train to a screeching halt. Masked riders swarmed the cars. The express agent resisted, guarding Wells Fargo's safe with shotgun in hand. But the outlaws carried dynamite, and with a thunderous blast, they shattered the express car, scattering splinters and steel across the desert floor. The gang seized over $50,000 in cash and gold, an astronomical sum in its day. Passengers were spared violence, though badly shaken. Within minutes, the Wild Bunch had vanished into the night, their horses pounding across the desert, leaving behind only smoke and shattered rails. The nation was stunned. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco carried lurid headlines. Wells Fargo and the railroads demanded justice, offering massive rewards. For the first time, Arizona's bandits were not just a local menace. They were front-page news, the talk of the nation. But with fame came pursuit. Wells Fargo hired Pinkerton detectives, the most feared manhunters of their era. These detectives tracked tirelessly, following the faintest trails across hundreds of miles. They interviewed ranchers, bribed informants, and gathered every scrap of intelligence on Cassidy and his men. The Wild Bunch answered with cunning. They rotated hideouts, used fresh horses stashed along the trails, and relied on a network of sympathizers. Some ranchers admired their audacity, others were too intimidated to betray them. Yet technology was turning against the outlaw. The telegraph carried news faster than a horse could gallop. Railroads extended their reach, shrinking the wilderness that once sheltered fugitives. The Wild Bunch could still outrun posses, but they could not outrun a changing world. By 1900, pressure mounted. Cassidy and Sundance knew their days in the United States were numbered. After one final round of robberies, including a raid on a mining payroll near Nevada, they fled south, eventually making their way to South America. Their fate remains one of the great mysteries of outlaw lore. Some say they met their end in Bolivia in 1908, gunned down by soldiers after a final, desperate shootout. Others claim they survived, living quietly under false names, their legend growing larger with each passing year. For Arizona, the Wild Bunch marked the last great gasp of the outlaw era. Their raids shook the territory, proving that even in a land scarred by decades of banditry, there were still bold new ways to defy the law. But their story also revealed a truth. The age of the desperado was drawing to a close. Lawmen were growing stronger, communications faster, and the frontier itself was vanishing. Still, the memory of the Wild Bunch lingered. In saloons and mining camps, men would lean across whiskey-stained tables and whisper of that night at Wilcox, when the desert sky lit with fire and the bandits vanished like phantoms into the mesas. And somewhere beyond, in South America or the afterlife, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid rode on in legend, forever chasing freedom under a desert moon. But while their story closed the chapter on organized outlawry in Arizona, the land itself remembered all who had come before: the masked riders, the border raiders, the phantoms of the mountains. And it is in that memory that the legacy of the desert desperados lives on. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Arizona Territory began to shed its lawless reputation. The telegraph wired towns together, railroads stitched the desert into the national fabric, and statehood loomed on the horizon. Outlaws, once able to vanish into wilderness for weeks, now found their movements tracked, their hideouts surrounded, and their names posted on telegraph wires across the West. The age of the desperado was ending. Yet the stories did not end with them. The death of William Brazen Bill Brazleton, the fugitive trail of the Apache Kid, the bloody raids of Augustine Chacon, and the daring train robberies of the Wild Bunch. All these tales lived on, carried in whispers, songs, and newspaper ink. Some were exaggerated beyond recognition, others softened with nostalgia, but together they wove a tapestry of memory that defined the Arizona frontier. Dime novels and pulp magazines seized on these stories, turning flesh and blood men into larger-than-life characters. Writers back east, who had never set foot in the Sonoran Desert, churned out tales of masked avengers and merciless killers. The desperados became not just criminals, but archetypes: the rebel against authority, the drifter who answered to no one, the outlaw whose freedom was bought in blood. Hollywood would later cement these images. Silent films of the early 1900s and then the great westerns of mid-century cinema borrowed freely from Arizona's outlaw lore. The bandit in a flour sack mask, the phantom Apache warrior, the train robber gang thundering across the desert. All were drawn from the raw material of real men who had once defied the law. But beneath the legends lay truths worth remembering. These desperados were not just romantic figures. They were men shaped by desperation, by poverty, by cultural upheaval, and by a land that demanded either resilience or ruin. Brazleton turned to robbery after mining dreams failed. The Apache Kid, once a soldier in U.S. uniform, became a fugitive when betrayal closed every other door. Chacon rose in defiance of border inequities, part criminal, part avenger. And Cassidy and Sundance, seeing the frontier vanish beneath their feet, sought freedom in lands farther still. Their legacy is written in the contradictions. To some, they were villains, deserving only the rope and the bullet. To others, they were survivors, men who struck back against an unforgiving system. And to history, they are both, criminals and cultural icons, ghosts who still ride the mesas in imagination, if not in flesh. Even today, the desert of Arizona holds their memory. In old stagecoach trails near Tucson, you can still walk where Brazleton drew his pistol. In the canyons of the Pinals, locals still whisper of the Apache Kid. In Solomonville, where Chacon was hanged, the story is remembered in hushed tones. And in Wilcox, railroad historians still point to the tracks where the Wild Bunch brought dynamite to bear on iron and steel. The Arizona desperados remind us that the frontier was not simply a land of progress and pioneers. It was also a land of hunger, vengeance, and defiance. A place where the line between justice and lawlessness was drawn and redrawn in desert dust. And so we ask, were these men devils of the desert or products of their time? Were they monsters or merely mirrors reflecting the struggles of a violent age? The answer lies perhaps somewhere between fact and legend, between the crack of a six-gun and the sigh of the desert wind. This was the story of the desert desperados, the bandits of Arizona Territory.